else in the room who hasn't before? Or online? No.
Anybody would like to introduce what you're doing, who you are? We haven't done it before. Everybody's done it? I don't think Andrew's done it.
Oh, this year? I
Yeah.
guess not. Yeah, I've been coming to Origins for many, many years, but for those who haven't seen me lately, because I guess I've been more online, this semester at least. I'm Andrew Uden. I'm a professor here at the Stewart Observatory. I work on various aspects of planet formation, planetary evolution. I'm happy to be hosting Tad's visit for 2 weeks here as he comes back. And the work I've done with Tad has mostly been on giant planets. So I'm excited to hear what he's doing with terrestrial planets. And then I guess the other thing to say, I was just chatting with Tad and saying that, oh, why don't we grab lunch afterwards, and anyone who wants to join, I'll find someplace to go together.
Okay. So I guess for those of you who don't know, Tad did his PhD here at the University of Arizona over in LPL, working with Adam Showman. For that, he got a bachelor's in geophysics sciences with a specialization in astrophysics at the University of Chicago. Went back to UChicago for a 51 Pegasi B postdoctoral fellowship, and now he is a faculty member at the University of Maryland in astronomy. Whenever you're ready to begin.
Thanks for the kind introduction, Sarah. Yeah, it's great to be back at Origins. I guess last time I gave a talk at Origins was maybe about 6 years ago. And this work is very, very different to what I was doing as a graduate student. So I'm excited to share it with you all. Also, thanks for taking time out of your JWST proposal deadline, push to come here. And it's 53 hours till the deadline or so. Yeah, not that anyone has a countdown clock on their second monitor. But yeah, I'll be talking about stuff that you probably won't be putting in your cycle 3 proposal. So hopefully this won't change your next 2 days. So I'll be talking about temperate rocky planets, especially those that we could potentially characterize in the area of JWST. So planets that have atmospheres. I won't be talking about this whole atmosphere versus no atmosphere dichotomy that people like Sarah are studying in detail right now. These are all kind of more hopeful theoretical predictions for what we can do down the road, maybe a few years from now, if we really start to understand stellar mitigation, stellar activity with JWST. So just to give you a brief outline, I'll be talking about kind of the theory of the climate and atmospheric circulation of rocky exoplanets, just to give you a primer to start and kind of our expectations for the habitability of these objects. And then I'll kind of move on to talk about how our understanding of habitability and how it's controlled by cloud coverage impacts potential observations, especially transmission spectroscopy of these planets. And then I'll talk about, if time remains at the end, a kind of fun side project on tropical cyclones on rocky planets. So just to give you a brief primer on typical rocky planet atmospheric circulation, here's a wonderful sketch of like a standard Earth-like, quote unquote, planet by Adam Showman that appeared in a 2013 review paper in the Comparative Climatology of Terrestrial Planets textbook. And
that's a published figure.
Yeah, it's a published figure.
Wow.
Yeah, you drew it. Yeah, by hand.
Yes.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, it's like he has lots of these in his notes too, but this is the only one that I know that's published. Yeah. But basically what you can see, this is not Earth itself, but this is maybe if you take Earth and you generalize Earth, maybe if you change the rotation rate or something. But generally speaking, Earth-like planets orbiting sun-like stars, we expect to be relatively rapidly rotating. And so their atmospheric circulation is driven by an equator to pole irradiation gradient. So right on an annual average, Earth receives more radiation at the equator than the pole, and this creates pressure gradients in the atmosphere that drive atmospheric circulation that are trying to reduce the equator to pole temperature gradient that arises due to the irradiation gradient. And so on Earth and on Earth-like exoplanets, this is expected to be accomplished in 2 separate ways. One, through Hadley's circulations in the tropics and potentially extending to the mid-latitudes, where you have rising motion at the equator and descending motion in the mid-latitudes. Notably, this descending motion leads to drying of the air. And so actually here in Arizona, right, the Sonoran Desert is a desert because this is at the edge of the Hadley cell where there's descending motion of dry air. And as it descends, it adiabatically warms. That's why it's hot and dry here, but it's cooling off, luckily, today. And then beyond the Hadley cell, the heat transport from equator to pole is accomplished not by these large-scale overturning circulations, but by small-scale eddies, so deviations from the mean flow, which are caused by fluid instabilities in the atmosphere. So these you can see as these hot and cold tongues on this diagram. And roughly speaking, you might expect that if these eddies are larger, they can accomplish more heat transport from the edge of the Hadley cell to the pole. And so the eddy size scales with rotation. So you might expect that rotation might control equator to pole heat transport. Yeah, Andrew.
So I realize if I ask you everything I don't understand about weather on Earth, this talk will never end. But I'll just start with I'll limit myself to this one to start. So because you said we're a desert, partly because we're at this latitude for the Hadley cell, but I just checked Google Maps, and indeed the southeast, which seems pretty green and humid and swampy, is at the same latitude.
Sure, yes, but basically all of the major deserts are at roughly 30 degrees north or south latitude. Like the Sahara, also at 30 degrees, right? Australia, Western Australia, the outback is roughly minus 30 degrees. But right, the reason that the southeast is moist and has a very different climate is because the oceanic circulation also plays a role. And generally speaking, western boundary currents in the ocean are hotter and faster than on the east, so you bring more of the warm surface water up from the tropics, and the western boundary current. Also, the Gulf of Mexico is very warm, and both of those result in moist air that causes the climate in the southeastern U.S. to be very different. I mean, you also, for example, in Southeast Asia, have a much wetter climate. Same thing.
Okay, so yeah, desert unless you're close to and downstream from a bunch of water.
Yes. Yeah. So land coverage matters for the climates of rocky planets. I won't be talking about land coverage, but people have studied this. Yeah.
Antarctica is a desert.
Sorry?
Antarctica.
Antarctica is a desert? Yeah, it's a desert too.
What have they saw?
No.
There's not another, yeah.
That's not because, not because of the Hadley cell, it's just because it's extremely cold.
Okay,
The air is dry.
There's not a circulation pattern, not some special polar circulation.
There are special polar circulation patterns in polar jets, but roughly it's just that there's less moisture near the poles. Yeah. Okay, anything else about this basic picture of Earth-like planets?
So polar circulation, so moisture is not delivered there. That's why it's dry. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Roughly. I mean, you can think of this as it's like a heat flux and a moisture flux, and the poles are cold and dry, and the equator is hot and wet, moist. Yeah.
Maybe just to throw out a future question, the jets on the right-hand side of your diagram there, are those going to be relevant for the rest of the talk? Is that out of the way?
Yeah, I mean, so Earth is really weird and special, and we're going to go pretty far away from Earth. The one thing that will be, so this diagram is not exactly Earth, because in this diagram, there's a super rotating equatorial jet. The planets that I'll be talking about do have these super rotating eastward equatorial jets. But Earth is also special because if this diagram were actually of Earth, you would really see one jet. So this subtropical jet, which is just due to angular momentum conservation, as the air that's moving poleward in the Hadley cell is basically just deflected by Coriolis conserved angular momentum. On Earth, this subtropical jet and this eddy-driven jet actually merge and form one jet in the mid-latitudes that goes across the continental US. But as you go to faster rotation, you would expect that they would separate because the Hadley cell wouldn't be as wide. And so this is kind of like maybe a faster rotating Earth that has super rotation, but this is really more of just a generalized picture of the source of circulation you might expect. Yeah.
So there's a question actually whether it works, it applies to the ocean world as well.
Yeah.
Different because it doesn't have land.
Yeah, I mean, like this basic picture that Adam's drawing here, this I would say is probably an aquaplanet, right? We don't see any asymmetry in the circulation as you go around latitude bands. Roughly like he's drawing some waviness, maybe some instabilities in the jet. I guess you can kind of see maybe this is a continent, but there's nothing clear that's happening at the interface of the continent and ocean. So, I mean, roughly speaking, throughout this talk, I'll be focusing only on fully water-covered planets, ignoring the impact of land.
So when you say Earth is special, You just mean Earth has land?
Earth is special because it's rotating at a rate such that these two jets merge, the eta-driven jet and the subtropical jet. It's also special, right? Yeah, because it has ocean and land, which we might not expect to be common. Water delivery fluctuates over a huge range, as you know, in planet formation simulations. But I mean, in general, we expect to find plenty of planets that are roughly like Earth. They must exist. Yeah, we just can't study them yet.
Yeah.
Anything else about Earth and Earth?
Okay. You can go to the next slide.
All right.
How long will it take?
So now let's kind of move away from our Earth-based understanding and think in a more general framework. And so to do this, I want to introduce kind of a simple non-dimensional dynamical parameter, which is called the weak temperature gradient parameter. This parameter requires first understanding another parameter, which is the Rossby deformation radius, which is shown here. This is the ratio of the gravity wave speed, here written as a Kelvin wave, to the Coriolis parameter. So this is like the speed of the wave divided by rotation. And roughly, you can think of the Rossby deformation radius as the distance to which a wave would propagate meridionally, so from like equator to pole, before it's deflected by the Coriolis force. And so basically, this tells you how far waves can mix the circulation and accomplish transport in planetary atmospheres. And importantly, right, it scales as 1 over Coriolis parameter, so it scales as 1. And so the WTG parameter is simply a ratio of this Rossby deformation radius to the planetary scale. So it's right, just the wave speed divided by the Coriolis force times maybe the planetary radius or whatever scale is relevant. And so you would roughly expect then, if this parameter is very large, if the Rossby deformation radius is much, much larger than the planetary scale, you would have relatively small temperature contrast because waves can transport heat, moisture from equator to pole. But otherwise, if this is small, which roughly applies to Earth, you would expect large equator to pole temperature gradients, and temperature gradients generally in the direction of a radiation contrast. And so Earth is an interesting case, again, so much special. It has a weak temperature gradient parameter that's just below 1, it's like 0.6. And so this implies that a weak temperature gradient assumption holds near the tropics. So rotation doesn't matter in the tropics of Earth, but then it begins to matter in the extratropics. And so Earth has 2 separate dynamical regimes, a tropical dynamical regime where rotation doesn't matter, and an extratropical regime at higher latitudes where it does matter. And so for the rest of this talk, I'll be talking,
Just so that I can be sure I understand the importance, especially the Rossby deformation radius. At a like first order, very basic physicist level, that would be, for instance, what sets the size of the Hadley cells, like how far up in latitude they extend?
Yeah, roughly it sets the size of the Hadley cells. In reality, so there's 2 different models for the Hadley cell extent. One is the classic Held and Howe 1980 model, and that one is basically related to the Rossby deformation radius and the deflection of the, equator to pole motions by the Coriolis parameter. But the updated model, the like Held 2000 model, is that the edge of the Hadley cell is set by the point at which baroclinic instability is set in. So instead of it just being purely like an angular momentum conserving flow, and that's what sets it, it's really instead the Hadley cell is disrupted at slightly lower latitudes because of these mid-latitude instabilities that end up, kind of cutting off the circulation. But they both roughly work for Earth. It's just as you go further away from Earth in rotation, you'll find that people have found that the instability model works better. But yeah, roughly this picture works. Okay, so in the remainder of this talk, I'll be focusing on planets that are orbiting close in around M-dwarf stars, because these are the ones that we can actually characterize. And so the important point I want to make about these planets is that they're roughly always in the regime where this WTG parameter is large. And so here I'm showing you 3 different GCM simulations by Mark Hammond and Ray Pierre Humbert. So this is for varying rotation periods of Tally-Lock planets that are Earth-sized orbiting an M-dwarf star. And so here's on the left is a 10-day rotator. And as you go to the right, this is faster rotation, which results in smaller WTG parameters. And you can see that as we go from left to right, on all these simulations, right, there's a large day to night temperature contrast, most clearly seen from the temperature contrast within the substellar point and these mid-latitude Rossby gyres. But you can see that as we go from left to right, the temperature contrast generally increase because the assumption of weak temperature gradients horizontally breaks down. And it breaks down significantly when you get to a value of 1. But you can see that as you change the strength of rotation, rotation begins to inhibit day-night temperature, inhibit day-night heat transport, and increase day-night temperature contrasts. And resultingly, you can get these extremely strong nightside cyclones, these so-called Rossby gyres, where it's coldest on these tightly locked rocky planets.
Sorry,
Yeah,
when you say horizontally, do you mean longitudinally or?
both.
Okay. Because I would have guessed that, I thought that my interpretation of the Rossby deformation radius, but that was something I should think about primarily latitude.
So yes, it is. It is primarily latitudinally. But basically, if you have a day to night irradiation contrast, that triggers large scale standing waves. And so if you have faster rotation, that confines the standing waves and changes the pattern of the standing waves and the resulting momentum and energy fluxes of the standing waves. So it's like the impact of rotation on the wave pattern then feeds back on the day night temperature contrast. But you're right. If you're thinking about an individual wave, it's going to be north south.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
All right. You're talking about like days of rotation and day night side, but these are tidally locked planets. So this is the orbital period?
Yeah, so it's assuming the orbital period is equal to the rotation period in all of these simulations. And every single simulation I will show you from here on out. Yeah, so
Right,
spin synchronized.
So in that case, I'm having trouble understanding why the faster rotation period, faster orbital period is causing these changes in the temperature contrast, given that you're not talking about, for instance, different parts of the planet being illuminated at different times.
Yeah, so right, yeah, in all these simulations, only the day side is illuminated, the night side is not illuminated. The reason why, like roughly speaking, why you would expect larger temperature gradients for the faster rotating cases is if you're just thinking about like a state of force balance, right? The circulation has to be in a state of force balance. You would expect as you go to faster rotation, the Coriolis force is stronger. And that is balanced, generally speaking, by in geostrophic balance, which doesn't exactly hold, but it's balanced by pressure gradients. And right, the pressure gradient is roughly the day to night, temperature gradient on a large scale. And so you'd expect if you have faster rotation, that can be balanced by larger day-night temperature contrasts. And so you'd expect larger day-night temperature contrasts for faster rotating planets, all other things being equal. Anything else on WTG? Okay, so people have applied kind of, these sorts of concepts, not just to study the circulation of rocky planets orbiting M-dwarf stars, but people are really most excited about, the habitability and the potential for surface liquid water in these planets, being potential sites where, life could form. Here, when I talk about habitability, I'll just use the traditional definition of surface liquid water and not think any deeper about it. But here are two simulations, just kind of showing you when you go to the state of the art of numerical modeling of temperate rocky planets, what the circulations look like. The top one is an Earth-like planet orbiting a sun-like star. So this is like taking a general circulation model, a 3D fluid dynamics model, coupled to non-gray radiative transfer for exoplanets, and then applying it back to Earth. And you can see that the circulation looks roughly like Earth. You have a hot equator, a cold pole, and you also have, if you look on the right, lots of clouds due to deep convection in the tropics near the equator, less clouds in the drier mid-latitudes. But then the bottom is taking the same GCM and running it for an Earth-like planet, so Earth-sized, Earth radius, Earth mass, Earth gravity, Earth atmosphere composition planet, but in this case, orbiting an M-dwarf, or in this case, a late K-dwarf star, with a very slow rotation period of 58 days or so. And so even though this planet has a pretty similar mean temperature to Earth, it has a drastically different, atmospheric climate and circulation. So in this case, you have a hot day side because it's only receiving irradiation on the day side, and a cold night side. And because it's being irradiated throughout the day side, it undergoes deep convection, and there's a significant amount of clouds on the day side of the planet. And this high day side cloud coverage can then feed back and affect the climate of the planet. And this is this simulation is reproducing results that were found a few years earlier. You would expect these clouds on the day side, right, because they have a high albedo, to reduce the amount of incident solar flux that makes it to the surface of the planet. And so they should cool the planet and promote habitability. And you would roughly expect this to go that if you go to even hotter planets, you should have more moisture in the atmosphere, more clouds, and so you should continue to cool the planet. So this is a stabilizing feedback that promotes habitability and extends the habitable zone.
So do the Earth ones, they have a liquidity in them?
In this case, no. Yeah, this is a zero
Okay.
liquidity Earth, for best comparison with the M-Dwarf.
Okay, that's what I was asking, yes.
Yeah, so no.
Obviously, I understand
either
that
one.
the highly locked ones cannot have.
Well, actually, maybe not. So there's some recent papers that are pointing out that in multi-planet systems, you can have planets that are locked into Cassini states. I mean, they wouldn't be totally locked then, but
Yes,
then
yeah, exactly. You cannot be
obviously,
both totally locked and have a liquid.
But yeah, I think people are realizing that like TRAPPIST-1, for example, those planets are likely not zero liquidy synchronized planets.
Right.
Yeah. But I will assume that in all these
That's
simulations. Yeah. Okay, so kind of just now showing the implications of the cloud coverage for the habitable zone itself. Here I'm showing a figure that goes back to Jun Yang's paper in 2014. This is like a classic habitable zone diagram. If you haven't seen this before, basically people plot the limits of the habitable zone as a function of stellar type, so stellar effective temperature going from M's to F's on the y-axis. And then the x-axis is either like semi-major axis, or in this case, stellar flux. So it increases from the right to the left, where 1, you can see Earth is right here on this diagram. And so this is comparing previous 1D predictions for the inner and outer edge of the habitable zone to like 3D models that include clouds and this albedo feedback. And you can see that the rapidly rotating planets where clouds don't have as much of a feedback on the climate have a pretty similar inner edge to the classical 1D models. There's just a little bit of a shift inwards because they actually include clouds consistently, whereas many 1D models don't. But then you can see that there's a very large change when you go to the slowly rotating and entirely locked regime, in which case you have dayside cloud coverage that causes this high albedo and shifts the inner edge of the habitable zone fairly close into the host star. And so it's been pointed out that maybe a lot of close-in planets around M-Dwarf stars might, have surface liquid water and be temperate because of this cloud feedback, assuming that they have atmospheres in the first place. And I'm not going to address that question. Let's talk to Sarah about that if you want to know more. Okay, any questions about this kind of basic picture of, the habitable zone from traditional climate models for exoplanets? Okay, so I'll just briefly note that this entire picture has kind of been turned on its head in the last couple of years by Martin Turbay. He has a couple of papers which show that if you start, instead of with a cold initial condition, instead of assuming that the planet forms like with a climate that's similar to modern Earth, if you assume that it actually starts out hot and you try to figure out what conditions are required for water to condense on the surface in the first place, you find a very different solution for the irradiation at which you might expect a planet to be habitable. And so kind of basically what he did is he conducted the same suite of models as in those Yang models from the last slide, but now he's starting with a hot initial condition. So here's like surface temperature plotted against stellar flux. And you can see in the Yang models, right, as you increase stellar flux, you eventually get to a point where the planet is uninhabitable, but it's at a pretty high value of stellar flux. This is relative to Earth. But if you start hot and then you cool down, you find that throughout most of this parameter space, water cannot condense on the surface of the planet. And you have to go to fairly low values of installation, quite below modern Earth, to allow for water condensation. And then, for the planet to actually be habitable in the first place.
What kind of time scale are you talking about?
What do you mean, like in the simulations or in reality?
Well, I guess what is the
The simulations are only integrated for maybe hundreds to thousands of Earth years. Relatively, they're GCMs.
Yeah, right,
You can't really
okay,
integrate them
yes.
much longer. Like they're already integrated to kind of the maximum amount of time that you can. But really what they're doing, right, is they're starting, the practical way they do this in the model is, right, you start with an installation, you see what like the steady state you get, and you reduce it and you just evolve the same model over time and kind of march it until it gets to water condensation. So it's kind of, right, it's like a numerical, kind of not necessarily a trick, but a strategy to, actually enable you to simulate these is, instead of doing all these as separate models, this is one model that slowly, reduce the insulation over time. But in terms of like practical evolution, right, what they're thinking about here is specifically like the motivating factor is Venus, right? I didn't include this, but there's this idea that Venus might have been habitable up to around 700, 800 million years ago because of the same exact reason that we expect highly locked rocky planets orbiting M-dwarfs to be habitable because of this daytime cloud deck. And then eventually, it finally got to the point where it kind of finally hit the runaway greenhouse threshold recently. But basically, the Turbay paper is saying, if you start out with Venus being warm, just due to copious amounts of water vapor, CO2 in the atmosphere during like a Higgian like era, just like Earth had, then you'll never get to the point where water condenses. And this is the key difference between Venus and Earth.
But yeah, you're still trying to, imagine. So you're like, should I think of this the initial starting condition as the beginning of the secondary atmosphere phase?
Yeah. So these are like 10 bar water vapor
Right,
atmospheres,
okay.
water and CO2. Yeah.
But they're obviously, but yeah, I guess it's uncomfortable to think about something that you're evolving for hundreds of years to simulate hundreds of millions of years
Of course.
possible evolution. And
Yes.
so
Yeah, so it's one potential initial condition, like a Hadean Earth-like initial condition. Basically. Yeah. And sure, right? We don't know the exact, atmospheric composition of Earth or Venus 4.2 billion years ago. That's true. Okay, so the basic reason that they find this in their models is because the planets have a nightside cloud deck. So this is like just a map of the water cloud. And you can see that there's no clouds on the day side, but there are clouds on the night side. The bottom and the right are just showing this in a different coordinate system where you flip the pole to the substellar point in tally locked cases. And so in this case, like anything greater than 0 is day side, anything less than 0 is night side, here and here. And basically the point is you get clouds that form on the night side. And if you have a cloud that forms on the night side, it doesn't have an albedo, it doesn't have a shortwave effect, it only has a long wave effect. So you have a cloud greenhouse effect that dominates instead. The clouds warm the atmosphere below and keep the planet hot and further prevents water condensation. So just kind of a caveat, we don't know the initial conditions, and the initial conditions really matter for habitability and climate. Okay, and so I'll just quickly mention, so this is their updated predictions for the inner edge of the habitable zone. So that's the red line here. And then this is the standard 1D line. And then this here is the Yang et al. Updated by Koparapu in 2017, slow rotating inner edge. And so you can see that the inner edge in the updated models with a hot start is much more stringent, actually even more so than traditional 1D models for habitability, because basically they predict that many planets that receive significantly more radiation than Earth will never condense water on their surfaces. And notably, actually, you can see on this diagram, modern Earth is within the inner edge, the water condensation limit from Turbay et al. And basically, it's only because Earth received a lower amount of insolation when it was younger due to the faint young sun that would have allowed it to condense surface liquid water in the first place under the Turbay model. Okay, so that was kind of an aside.
So
yeah,
when you talk about the 1D models, to what extent are so okay, it says 1D cold start. So for the 1D models, what's the kind of evolutionary timescale that gets covered?
Usually, I mean, the 1D models are run to like radiative convective equilibrium. So it's not necessary. Some of them are time stepping and some of them are not. So it depends on the type of 1D model. Some are like inverse 1D models where you're basically matching onto an adiabat and just solving for radiative balance roughly, but some are time stepping, but even the time stepping ones, it's comparable, thousands of years at most.
Is there a reason that nobody's doing 100 million year, giga-year 1D models? It's not like you couldn't do it.
So people do like much longer timescale evolution of atmospheres. Like there's models like V-Planet that do like the interior atmosphere coupling and then the atmospheric evolution. And also like Laura Schaefer at Stanford has a similar model. But those are kind of like box models that don't treat the atmosphere properly. If you want to do like the actual, convection, radiative transfer in the atmosphere.
But
but like,
really do convection,
what,
but I mean.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically asking why isn't there a MESA for terrestrial planet atmospheres? And I mean, yeah, there should be.
It doesn't need to be a MESA, but it doesn't mean somebody shouldn't be, right? It seems like it's such a finely tuned system, a wide variety of parameters, and you could be getting it 100% wrong based on guessing the initial condition.
Yeah.
I guess part of the answer is MESA is very simple radiative transfer.
Yeah, it would be a lot harder if you have not volunteering.
Anything else on this? All right, and so one other point I guess I'd like to make before talking about like research stuff is that generally speaking, all the models I'm showing you are like time averages, and of course we live on a planet with weather. We know that planetary atmospheres and circulation is not static; it's time dependent and variable. And so like here's like just showing you these are maps of outgoing long wave radiation on top of atmosphere for one simulation at 4 different hemispheres. But if you look at these maps, instead of in an average sense, in a time variable sense, you're looking at outputs every 6 hours, right? You see significant variability in what the planet would appear just in terms of volumetric thermal flux. And you can see if you look at the 2 different terminators, east versus west, there appears to be more variability near the east. Like we have kind of these regions of very low emitted thermal flux, which are cloud tops that are basically, you see as the clouds are generated by convection near the substellar point and transported to the eastern terminator, right? They dissipate over a given time scale and sediment out of the atmosphere. But basically, right, planets are constantly undergoing an interplay between convection and atmospheric circulation and transport and cloud microphysics that shapes the effective variability that we see. And I'll be talking a little bit about variability in the rest of the talk. So just to kind of pose a few driving questions that I'll try to answer in like maybe 15-ish minutes. I'll probably skip the last one on tropical cyclones, but we can talk about that offline. I wanted to kind of describe how the cloudiness of temperate rocky planets is kind of more generally set. I showed you some example simulations, but it's strongly dependent on rotation. And then how the cloud cover can affect climate and observable properties, especially transmission spectra. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about this time variability and how it might impact our inferences. So first off, right, I showed you some simulations of slow rotating planets, but the cloud coverage on these temperate rocky planets is expected to be strongly dependent on their rotation. And so here I'm just showing you kind of very simple ExoCAM simulations, the same model that was used for those Kopparapu GCMs earlier, of varying planets that are orbiting an M-dwarf star with varying rotation period from 2 days on the top left to 16 days on the bottom right. And I'm just showing plots of the total cloud fractions, and these are just maps of the integrated cloud fraction in each column of the atmosphere. And you can see that in the fast rotating cases, there's actually very little cloud near the substellar point. And instead, only when you get to relatively slow rotation periods, there's kind of a transition between 8 and 16 days, occurs roughly at 10 to 12 days, depending on stellar properties, where you start to have a lot of clouds on the day side, and this cloud albedo feedback kicks in. So right, in the kind of first key point is rotation controls not only these day-night temperature gradients, but also the cloudiness of rocky exoplanets. But then, right, how does this then match on to what we can actually try to observe and probe? Right, there's kind of a secondary effect, which is that rotation not only affects how much clouds you have, just like the total cloud fraction, it also impacts where in the atmosphere the clouds are. And so here I'm showing a plot from a paper by Gabby Sweetset et al. So this is showing for 3 different simulations, a rapid rotating case, an intermediate rotating case, and a slow rotating case, the total amount of ice clouds on the top and liquid water clouds on the bottom. These are zonal means, so east-west means plotted as a function of latitude and pressure. And you can see for both of the different cloud types, as you go to slower rotation, the cloud mass peaks at lower pressure, so higher in the atmosphere. And this is roughly simply because deep convection extends over a broader range of the day side in the slower rotating cases. And so you can pump up moisture to lower pressures and promote cloud formation higher in the atmosphere. Effectively, the tropopause moves upwards in the slower rotating cases. And so you can see in like the slow rotating case here, the ice clouds especially have, their peak and mass mixing ratio at a pressure of maybe 10 millibar or so. And just to give you a point of reference, for Earth, the tropopause is at a pressure of around 100 millibar. So you're kind of shifting up the moist region of the planet by an order of magnitude. And as many of you probably know, transmission spectra preferentially probe relatively shallow regions of planetary atmospheres because you're probing the passage of light through the limb of the planet. And so this is a nice figure from a review by Eliza Kempton. If you imagine the stars on the left here, and you're shooting rays from the star through the planetary atmosphere, and we're the observer on the right, looking at the resulting transmission spectrum, you would expect that if you have a higher cloud deck, so at lower pressures, they would block the passage of starlight through the limb and result in weaker spectral features than if we had a deep or no cloud deck in the planetary atmosphere. So clouds can really impact the amplitude of transmission spectra that we might want to observe with, maybe JWST. And so just to show you, this practically does occur in models when you take a GCM and you post-process it. Sweet out 2020 did the same thing. Here's an example from my work. But just if you take simulations without clouds, those are the solid points, you get pretty large spectral features. These are just water vapor spectral features, but there's 60-ish ppm, which should potentially be detectable with JWST. But then if you include clouds, the spectral features amplitudes are significantly diminished. And they're diminished more for slower rotating cases beyond this transition from less cloudy to cloudier planets. Okay, so in the rest of this talk, I'm just going to talk about one specific exoplanet, one actual exoplanet. These are kind of generalized models. And that's TRAPPIST-1e, just because this is, roughly speaking, our best, maybe only case of actually having a chance to characterize the climate of a terrestrial planet with JWST, just because it orbits the smallest stars, the largest spectral features in transmission, because it goes as RP over R star squared. And so here I'm just showing you kind of, at this point, old general circulation models from Eric Wolf, just pointing out that TRAPPIST-1e is like potentially the most robustly temperate planet that orbits a late type M dwarf star that we can characterize with JWST. So these are models for planet F on the top in the system. So further out, E are these three models, and then D on the bottom. And they assume different amounts of carbon dioxide, right, greenhouse gas that warms the surface. Or in this case, for planet D, it has no CO2, just pointing out that for planet D, which is close in, even with no CO2, just with a 1 bar nitrogen water vapor atmosphere, it's likely in a runaway state with extremely hot, surface temperatures. And the GCM can't model the transition, but it eventually loses its surface liquid water and be like Venus. But you can see planet F, conversely, even with a 5 bar carbon dioxide atmosphere, you can't warm the surface significantly enough to actually have liquid water persist, and only planet E is in a state where you have surface liquid water, at least covering a small portion of the day side for varying amounts of CO2, going from Earth-like amounts of CO2 to the -4 bars to very high values of CO2, 2 bars. In all cases, it's habitable, roughly speaking, as long as you define habitability by having some surface liquid water. I'm going to skip this slide. And people have simulated GCMs of TRAPPIST-1e. So, just kind of running traditional models without any CO2, you might expect that potentially you can detect spectral features like carbon dioxide in its atmosphere. If you pump up the amount of CO2 to maybe a few tens of millibars, you could also maybe detect oxygen and ozone if you can go to shorter wavelengths. TRAPPIST-1e is like kind of in an interesting regime because it's has a rotation period of 6.1 days. So it's kind of in between a fast rotating and an intermediate rotating or slow rotating planet. So it's cloudy, but it's not too cloudy, which makes it a good target. And people have also pointed out that potentially, if you include photochemical haze in models of TRAPPIST-1e, because it orbits a late type M dwarf star, and you might expect, especially if it has methane in its atmosphere, it could have organic hazes. These hazes could mute short wavelength spectral features. But even then, as long as you have some CO2 in the model, you have detectable carbon dioxide and maybe methane spectral features. Okay. Sorry for the whirlwind background on TRAPPIST-1. So just kind of getting to a bit of research results, I'll try to finish in like 5 or 6 minutes. Here's kind of just showing you GCM simulations of TRAPPIST-1e. So these are kind of like standard models, again, ExoCAM GCM, in this case with Earth-like amount of nitrogen, but 1/10 of a bar of CO2, so far more CO2 than modern Earth by about 3 orders of magnitude. And here, these simulations are just showing kind of the variability over the course of 1 Earth month in the model. So this is showing a temperature map on the left. The right is showing, and the colors, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, the specific humidity, mass mixing ratio, and the contours, the amount of cloud. And bottom right is showing the vertical winds, which kind of links to convection. And you can see that there's large scale variability in the temperature pattern. It's most clear if you look at like the motion of these cyclones on the night side that are part of the planetary scale standing wave pattern. You can see these lows of the Rossby waves migrate back and forth. And conversely, if you look over here, there are anticyclones that are hot regions with higher pressure And those also kind of slosh back and forth. So, right, you kind of visualize this as like the entire planet is like a wave on a string, kind of vibrating. In this case, the vibrations are largely Rossby waves. And then if you look on the right, you can see that even just at the terminators, just due to this large scale variability, there's variability in the amount of water vapor at the terminator and also the cloud coverage at the terminator. And so you might expect that this variability could have, an imprint on transmission spectra. And one issue, right, is if we want to detect spectral features with JWST, we probably want to stack many, many transits together. And so you might anticipate that if the baseline level of the atmosphere, like the cloudiness, is changing, that would affect the continuum level in transmission spectra and might affect our inferences. And I'll note that this work is done by Yoav Rotman, who's currently an ASU second-year grad student. Go Wildcats. So here's resulting transmission spectra from basically, the same simulation, same amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. These are showing transmission spectra from each plot as an individual day. And the gray lines kind of show spectra at each point on the limb. Like if you take each point on the limb and you imagine that's the entire limb. And the red is the limb average transmission spectra, so what you would actually observe. And you can see, especially if you look at the baseline, the continuum level, which is roughly set by the cloudiness of the atmosphere, the continuum level of is shifting up and down in time by roughly 10 ppm. And so this isn't large enough to impact, right, whether or not you can see these whopping spectral features. Like we could definitely see the CO2 spectral feature, which actually is saturated in this simulation, it's so large. But it would impact the exact, abundance that we're deriving for different molecules in the atmosphere, given that the cloud cover is changing. I will note that actually doing this in practice is, a huge challenge. We don't even know if TRAPPIST-1e has an atmosphere, but just in principle, if we can get to the point where we can characterize the atmosphere of TRAPPIST-1e, then variability won't impact our ability to determine whether or not it has an atmosphere and what it's made of. With JWST, but it will impact our ability to pull out detailed abundance measurements. And so I guess just I think I'll do 2 more slides and then stop for time. So if you take not just that one simulation, I was just showing you one case with a partial pressure of CO2 of 0.1 bar, which accounts, which is shown in the top middle here. These are now transit spectra shown from 5 different simulations with varying PCO2. So from 1 bar of CO2 to 10 to the minus 4 bars of CO2. And then I'm further showing 5 more simulations. So the red lines are simulations without any added methane in the model, and the blue lines include methane in the simulations. You can mostly see methane at 3.3 microns through the strong feature, especially that pops up in low CO2 cases. But you can see, right, the transmission spectra are strongly dependent on the amount of CO2. And this is right because CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It affects the climate in and of itself. And so in the higher PCO2 cases, you can see that the baseline, the continuum level moves upward. That's because the atmosphere is cloudier, because it's more moist, because it's hotter. And so as a result, the deepest level in the atmosphere you can probe is higher up in the higher PCO2 cases. You can also see that when we include methane, right, you can't really see any clear methane feature in the high PCO2 cases, but it pops out as you go towards lower values of CO2. So right, there's kind of a complex relationship between the abundance of CO2 and the presence of methane. Here, we're just assuming the methane is at an Earth-like abundance, which we don't know what the methane abundance might be. But in practice, there are some regimes in terms of the amount of CO2 and the amount of methane where they both are detectable together. And so here, I think I'll just show this as my last slide. This is a plot from Yoav's paper showing that potentially CO2 and methane could be detectable at values of intermediate CO2. We don't know what the value of PCO2 is on TRAPPIST-1e, but this is showing on the top the signal noise ratio for one transit of carbon dioxide, water vapor, and methane with near spec prism, so from 0.6 to 5.2 microns, and the number of transits that would then be required to detect each species. And so you can see that the CO2 detectability, the number of transits to detect it, scales inversely with the abundance of CO2, right? If you have more CO2, it's easier to detect, that makes sense. Water is really hard to detect in most cases. It's only detectable if you assume a 0 noise floor, which is not very realistic. So water is probably challenging to detect, which makes sense because water is what's forming the clouds. It's hard to see beneath the cloud deck. The water has to be transported above the cloud deck, but you would expect it to condense out. So roughly speaking, it's challenging to detect water. And then methane is detectable at low values of CO2 and then becomes undetectable at very high values of CO2 as the CO2 features start to overwhelm the methane features. And so potentially there's a sweet spot, if TRAPPIST-1e has a little bit more CO2 than Earth, but not too much more, then, you could potentially detect both CO2 and methane together. And if we have, some indication of the broader, chemical context of the system, we might be able to make inferences about how that could link to habitability. Okay, I think I'm at 45 minutes, so I think I'll skip to conclusions and just summarize. So I discussed how tally-locked rocky planets should have a dayside cloud deck that is enabled by deep convection due to their slow rotation. I showed you how these planets will have, these high-altitude clouds will stabilize the climate of these planets, assuming that they form cold, and potentially extend the edges of the habitable zone. And lastly, I showed you how climate variability can impact our characterization of these planets with JWST and kind of the hopes for if everything goes right with these planets having atmospheres, the stars not being too active or stellar mitigation being feasible, are the potential to actually characterize what these atmospheres are made of. Thanks so much for your attention. I could take more questions, of course.
Can I just clarify for the Rotman paper that you were just showing?
Yeah.
That's just doing each of those predictions. It's a different GCM with a different abundance, different set of abundances. And then making a synthetic spectrum.
Yeah, so for each of these, so we're running 10 different GCMs with varying amounts of CO2 and varying whether or not we have methane. And then, running them to equilibration, post-processing them with a rate of transfer tool to get a spectrum. And then, that's what's shown.
So when you go to the next plot, I guess, which had this sort of detectability, right? I mean, how easily predictable is the predictability as a function of these parameters?
What do you mean?
So do you need to, if I want to expand this parameter space, do I need to run 100 new simulations? Can you, right? So, I mean, some of these lines look like you could very easily extrapolate, right?
Yeah,
and I guess I'm thinking about this in the context of doing modeling this way versus retrievals.
Yeah.
Where you're entirely agnostic about physics.
So so in the retrieval frameworks, so I think right, in principle, what we want to do, right, we want to do retrievals, right? The way that these are calculated is you're taking the spectrum and you're just like summing up, the feature strength over the wavelength range. But in reality, to actually detect and claim a feature, you need a retrieval.
Right. And
so the right way, the right way to do this in practice is to, use the general circulation models to inform the choices made in the retrievals to make the models more realistic, right? So making choices about, your priors for cloud deck height, thinking about what's the possible, range of cloud mass mixing ratio you might have, and maybe adding some extra complexity in terms of like the optical properties of the clouds, in terms of choosing what kinds of clouds might form for different types of planets in the retrievals. But practically speaking, I mean, it'd be amazing to run, thousands or tens of thousands of GCMs and do a retrieval. And I think people definitely are pushing towards that as, computational power increases over time. But practically speaking, I think, we're going to use standard 1D retrievals that are informed by these 3D results.
Right. So, but when you do this synthetic, you make a synthetic spectrum from each of these GCMs, is your detectability is not, did the retrieval recover it?
No.
It's just
very simply, basically just looking at the signal noise of the spectral features sum up over the bandpass, which is obviously not how we're doing this in practice.
So you have several questions online. Jim Casting asks, is some group currently collecting transit data on TRAPPIST-1e with JWST? If so, how long before we can test your predictions?
I mean, yes, I know Nicole Lewis has GTO data of TRAPPIST-1e. And of course, many more people have data for TRAPPIST-1b and c. I know also Bjorn Benecke and what's her, I'm forgetting the name of the first author of the paper, but they also have data for, I think it's F, or is it G?
G.
It's G, okay, thank you.
Lim.
Yeah, Olivia Lim, thank you. All right, thanks, Avi, thanks, Sarah. And basically in all of these cases for transmission spectra specifically, it seems like it's the stellar inhomogeneity is an activity that is dominating over any planetary signal. And so, right, this is the transit light source effect that Benjamin Rackham, Daniel Pailly in this department worked on for Ben's thesis. And right, basically the issue is that if the star is inhomogeneous, then the stellar spectral features due to star spots and other inhomogeneity, because these are cool stars that have molecular signatures, dominates over any planetary signatures. So we have to remove out the stellar contamination effect first before going after any of this. And so I think all of the transit spectroscopy for TRAPPIST-1 is currently in the regime where people are still trying to diagnose how to remove stellar spectral features. Because the data I've seen, and including Olivia's data, shows stellar spectral features that are larger than the spectral features of, for example, CO2 that you see in these GCMs. They're on the order of like 80 ppm. Thanks, Sarah. So there's another question in the chat. Could you simulate Earth climate just after a moon formation? Initial rotation period was 2 to 6 hours. That's a great idea. I don't know that that's been done with a 3D GCM. I think it's been done with 1D radioconvective models. But yeah, I mean, that's a great idea. I think basically the challenge and the reason why only the Turbay group has simulated these extremely hot atmospheres with no surface liquid water soon after the formation of Earth or Venus is just simply because no other rocky planet GCM, which in most cases you just take an Earth model and you scale it, you may maybe remove the rate of transfer routine and you change the opacities to go to higher temperatures. But most like models like ExoCAM basically break once you go above surface temperatures of around 350 to 400 K. And so the LMD model, the PCM, planetary climate model, generic PCM, is at present the only model that both matches Earth and can be extended to extremely non-Earth-like conditions, much hotter especially. And so potentially, yes, they could do that. Any other questions in the room? There's one more on Zoom.
Ask a follow-up based on that. So when you say, is it a matter of the approximations in the solution of the equations, or is it just opacity tables and things like that that limits the extrapolation? Like, what's the problem?
It's a bit bigger than just opacity tables. It's the subgrid parameterizations are all tuned to Earth, and so you have to remove all of those and start from scratch, and come up with more generalized subgrid prescriptions for things like convection. And so the LMD team has done this. It's taken them a long time. They've been working on exoplanet models for over a decade. But other teams like the UK Met Office team are also working in this direction. But yeah, it just basically requires you to not just simply take the Earth model and change.
Sure, yeah. I'm just wondering. Yeah, so it's mostly subgrid models that are a problem.
Yes.
Okay. Avi's question.
Yeah, so Avi has a question of what other aerosols could be present: ice clouds, hazes, etc., and how much uncertainty does this add to the signal strength? So yeah, in this case, we're considering only liquid and ice water clouds, but I had a slide earlier, let me find it, that is from, in this case, simulations by Thomas Fauchez, but there's also other models by Howard Chen, which show that if you include photochemistry and resulting haze formation, also Sarah has done this a lot with detailed 1D models that actually include complex, cloud microphysics with Virga, and also she does lab work. But practically speaking, especially if you have haze that's relatively small particle sizes, you would expect it to really impair your ability to assess spectral features at short wavelengths from maybe the visible out to around 2 microns in this specific case. And so yeah, hazes are definitely a challenge, and we require coupled photochemical dynamical modeling, I'd say, with 3D GCMs, where you take a photochemistry model and you either directly couple it or indirectly couple it to the dynamics to get accurate both haze and condensate cloud distributions.
So I have a kind of naive question about stellar activity. These are tidally locked and they're awfully close. So there could be some of them, and M-type stars are very active. So how does that affect your simulation? Are you considering some of the activity?
Yeah, so I'm not considering that in any of the simulations I showed. To my knowledge, the only 3D GCMs, there's 1D models do include this, especially evolution models, like the ones Caitlin was referring to earlier, are from Howard Chen et al. And so he has a couple of papers where he looks at basically like photochemistry induced by both stellar activity and stellar flares. So like just in general, the UV, but also specifically flares. And he finds, yeah, you can significantly change the upper atmosphere abundances of photochemical products due to stellar flaring.
Yes, so like a flaring doesn't last there's a timeline, right? It's not constant. It happens episodically. So during that time, if you're observing it, then the spectra would look different, basically.
Yeah, so what he shows is that both you would expect variability and abundances due to the flares, but also it will change the mean state, right? Because you have repeated flaring, and over time that affects the chemistry. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, we have another online from Vlad. What's the impact of climate model predictions on the extension of the upper boundary higher than 60 kilometers? How can the photochemistry of the mesosphere affect your results given high levels of XUV flux? Yeah, another thing that Howard Chen is the person who said it. I mean, Vlad, yeah, Howard was a postdoc at Goddard and he worked with you. So, yeah, I'd say Howard is right. He's the only person who is doing these coupled chemistry climate models like CCMs rather than GCMs for these highly locked rocky exoplanets at present. I mean, other groups are pushing in this direction, like UK Met Office. But right, yeah, I mean, Howard basically showed that especially predictions for the moist greenhouse, which is basically another inner edge that is set rather than by the runaway where the surface gets too hot for water to condense. Instead, the moist greenhouse is set by the point at which you begin to lose copious amounts of water vapor to space due to photodissipation of water vapor and resulting loss of hydrogen. The moist greenhouse inner edge predictions strongly depend on the height of your model and how accurately you simulate the upper atmosphere. For example, Howard showed that you actually transport a lot less water vapor up to low pressures than previous, simpler models that didn't actually properly simulate the upper atmosphere predicted, and so that effectively reduces the impact of the moist greenhouse. But yeah, Vlad, I mean, yeah, NASA Goddard is certainly a leader in this work.
Thanks.
A minute or two for further questions. If not, thank Tad for a really interesting talk.
Best of luck with your JWST